It's a pleasure to be chairing this meeting, primarily intellectual pleasure, because what we're celebrating is the publication of, I think, a timely but fascinating book, Jihadism Transformed. And I think I must, as an academic and as an envious one, I must compliment the editors both on the timing of this as we struggle with the Battle of Mosul and ponder what the future of Daesh will be after Mosul, but also the content. I think this is incredibly, I was lucky enough to get the book, incredibly rich, empirical and analytical diet of both the ideological trends that unite and divide the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but also some incredibly focused and detailed case studies of where either group has spread. So to unpack this and to give you an insight and to drive you out to the bookshops around the neighbourhood to pay for the small amount of money for such a rich insight. We have four speakers. There'll be more of this later. A rich insight. We have four speakers, all of which will take 10 minutes or less to speak. We'll start with the two editors, Dr. Awan and Dr. Staffel, and then we'll go to Virginia and Martha Turnbull and Virginia Comedy, who will then give you their take on the topic. Dr. Awan is Associate Professor of Modern History and Political Violence. Oh, great, I wish I had a title like that, and Terrorism at the Royal Holloway University of London. Simon is a UK government expert on the Middle East counter-terrorism and extremist ideology, who holds a PhD for the University of Sussex. Martha is the head of the FCO's National Security Research Group, whose research focuses, obviously, I suppose, on international Islamic extremism, especially groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And finally, Virginia is the star of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Senior Fellow in Security and Development, and has published a superb book on Boko Haram, which I also urge you to run out and buy, and was the co-author of Drugs, Insecurity and Failed States, The Problems of Prohibition as well. So, without further ado, Dr. Awan will start.
Simon will start.
Yeah, Simon will start.
Oh dear.
I can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I should start with an apology and a caveat that although I do work as a government official, and the caveat probably applies to Martha as well, so we'll get it in early. Very much speaking in a personal capacity, personal stroke academic capacity, so no government lines this afternoon. You might be relieved to hear. I'll start by introducing the volume as a whole, which started 2 years ago, almost exactly to the day, with a conference that we organised at RUSI. Apologies to our hosts, but that's where it was. And I was fresh off the plane, literally from Cairo. I'd arrived and came straight over. And essentially the purpose of that conference was to take stock of where the jihadist narrative had gone over the preceding 2 years and look ahead to the future. So thinking from kind of Arab Spring, also called Arab Spring, I guess now, onwards, and thinking about trajectories, and very much trying to get a sense of the jihadist narrative over time and also over a wide geography. So we deliberately asked area specialists, different areas of the world, to think about what had happened in a specific locale. The product of that conference was then a project which carried on and ended up in the chapters that we have in the book. If I pull out what I think are some of the main themes going through the volume, first of all, and others I'm sure will pick up in more detail. As expected when we were in that conference 2 years ago, there were various areas where the jihadi narrative was consistent and the kind of Salafi jihadi worldview was what you would expect. So ideas like the war on Islam, particular historical references, crusades, etc. The importance of mobilization of the Ummah to fight against perceived grievances and the obligation of violent jihad. So these kind of Salafi jihadi worldviews were clearly very dominant. But there were also clear points of discontinuity between particularly the Al-Qaeda type jihadist ideology, if you will, and the kind of more Islamic State type ideology. To pull out a few, I would say when we talk in the introduction about how the didactic use of violence was a clear theme from some of the Islamic State type actors. Naila, who talks a lot about the kind of Zakawite trend that actually went a long way back before Baghdadi's introduction of a so-called caliphate. But clearly there was a trend about how violence and savagery was being used for this didactic impact, and we talk a bit about that in the introduction, and as I say, in other chapters. There was a clear trend around the intensity of schisms and sectarianism, which unfortunately we've only seen continue to increase ever since. So in my study 2 years ago, I looked at around 400 jihadist texts, and one of the only real trends that you could see in terms of a clear increase in the number of instances of particular kind of language, it was around schisms, intra-religious or sectarian conflict. So that was a clear trend. And the final one that I'd pull out is the kind of nature of eschatology between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, which very kind of crudely can be summarised. I think that Al-Qaeda kind of imagined this eschatology, which Islamic State were then claiming to realise in their state project, in the state building project. And with that, all of the ideology which we talk about in the introduction, and Akil in his chapter also, about how that big state building project became actually perceived as a positive vision for the future, as opposed to a much more kind of abstract eschatology in Al-Qaeda's discourse. So those were the themes that we picked out of discontinuity. But the other thing that we looked became clear, probably before, but certainly during the period over the last 2 years that we were going into more detail, was how different the local narratives were, and how actually it was misleading in one sense to just take this kind of global view of jihadist narratives, but you really needed to dig into what was happening in each area. And the contributors have done that very well for different areas. For my area, my chapter in the book, we looked at Egypt as an example of this, and it's very easy to see what happened in Egypt as a kind of Islamic State, a Daesh takeover of a local jihadist movement in the Sinai and Al-Qaeda al-Maqdis. But actually, when I looked at the discourses, when I looked at the texts and put it in a historical context of what happened in Egypt, there was something much more complicated going on, where actually the Islamic State, Daesh movement were struggling to perform a kind of hostile takeover of Al-Qaeda al-Maqdis, losing some of the Al-Qaeda al-Maqdis senior leadership, and there was a kind of schism again, so schisms being tried again, but actually having to accommodate far more than you might expect the local narrative in Egypt. So rather than the kind of global idea of a caliphate project, state building project, and the savagery, which I've mentioned as a kind of global theme, in Egypt and in Sinai, the discourse became much more focused on grievances against the security forces in North Sinai, and a focus on Israel, and very kind of locally specific ideas. And you can actually see in the text movement back and forth between the two. So at one time, going more towards Al-Adnani at the time's narrative, and Al-Adnani was making speeches about Egypt, and then shifting back, because you could almost see that they realised that wasn't going to work in Egypt and he needed to rethink. So the other authors look at other areas in a similar way, some who are here and other authors who are not here today. And the interesting thing for me was how different that was in Egypt, this particular area. So I looked at an area where Daesh were the kind of the ascendant organisation, who were kind of winning, if you like, the battle of ideas in that area. In Yemen, for example, Elizabeth Kendall, who's not here today, saw the exact opposite with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, actually being much more successful at capturing the local narrative. So I think I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to a discussion where we might start to dig into where now and where next and what this means for the future. But I think perhaps I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stand.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. All right. That's fantastic. Okay, thank you, Toby. Thank you to Virginia and to IISS for hosting the event. My chapter deals with evolving narratives, evolving jihadist narratives, and their impact they've had on radicalization in the West. That's my particular angle in this. I realize we have 10 minutes, and Toby has made that abundantly clear many times. So I'm going to focus less on Al-Qaeda and the evolution of the narrative, and more on what really seemed to be working for ISIS, and why their narrative seemed to be appealing so strongly. So, since announcing its so-called caliphate in June of 2014, ISIS managed to draw thousands of foreign fighters from every corner of the globe, willing to fight and even die for its so-called caliphate. A small minority of these have even brought violence back home with them, and the siren song of ISIS, as we know, has also reached across the globe to inspire many individuals to carry out domestic terror attacks in their home countries too, despite not having any tangible links to the group, or despite not having received training from the group. So why does the narrative of ISIS appear to resonate with them? That's the question that I really want to address today. Now, one way of thinking about this is that the narrative or the ideology is offering something. It's one of the important pull factors. It's the appeal. But the individual's context and their personal circumstances are really central to whether or not that narrative, that ideology, resonates with them on an individual personal level. You can think of those as the push factors. So why do these narratives resonate? What is that compels young people to buy into that narrative? And I should say that they are overwhelmingly young, almost certainly under the age of 30, but predominantly under the age of 25. It's a very complex question, and of course we can't do justice to that in 10 minutes, but I want to touch on three aspects that I think are really quite important. The role of religion, the role of identity crises and belonging, and the role of socioeconomic marginalization. And these three things are interrelated. They're more than the sum of their parts. So let's deal with religious literacy first. Sorry, let's deal with the role of religion first. And one inescapable and glaring inconsistency when you look at the biographies of many of the Western jihadists and recruits to IS is just how religiously illiterate the vast majority of them have actually been. Most are not particularly religious prior to their involvement in violence, often raised in largely secular households, and often have a very rudimentary grasp of their parental faith. Recent documents and records from ISIS, as we know, showed that the vast majority of Western ISIS recruits had their level of religion classified as novice on the documents. Nevertheless, one of the stubborn, enduring myths surrounding jihadist terrorism has been this preeminence of religious over other motivations, and it's easy to understand why that might be the case. Of course, religion is stated as being an important part of their own rationale for doing these things. But crucially, in many of these instances, we have to be aware of the post hoc attribution of religious meaning and validation to their acts. What I mean by that is that religion might not provide the initial motive, but it almost always has to provide the motif or the stamp of approval afterwards. Take the example of a young man who wants to go to Syria to fight for any reason that's not explicitly religious. It's not enough to just fight or even die like a jihadi, but to be accepted by that community, and indeed not to end up beheaded as a member of a rival group. You need to walk, talk, and behave like one of them too. And the highly stylized genre of video martyrdom testaments that suicide bombers record prior to their deaths are a really good example of this sort of conformity. It's no accident they all look and sound pretty much the same. One telling and now quite famous example of this sort of religiosity tacked on at the end is these two young British men from Birmingham who were jailed for travelling to Syria to join and fight alongside a jihadist group in 2013 in response to what they saw as a religious duty. But this is what they bought from Amazon before they left, and I promise that I'm not making this up. They bought the books Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies, and they prove quite revealing about their lack of religious literacy and also motivation. And of course that doesn't apply to everyone, but generally that characterization does tend to hold true for a vast majority of Western recruits. Whether that's been people travelling to fight for ISIS abroad or even carrying out attacks at home. Now, this isn't to exonerate religion in any sense, but unlike believers, academics tend to understand religion in a different way, understand religion in epiphenomenal terms, so either as products of social, economic, political and other factors, or understanding religion as something that offers solutions to something. So one of the questions that we might ask is, what does religion offer a solution to in the case of Western jihadists? And I think the first thing that it offers a solution to very clearly is it answers the need to belong. Many jihadists commonly experience an intense form of identity crisis that can be explained through a process I call dual cultural alterity. Essentially all that means is a double alienation or a double sense of otherness from both minority culture, ethnic or parental culture, and majority culture, mainstream or host society culture, as a result of being unable or unwilling to fulfill either group's normative expectations, and is likely to inspire feelings of uprootedness and a lack of belonging. And so in the absence of this an appealing cultural example or paradigm from their parents or from mainstream society, religion becomes by default the principal anchor of identity. So it's identity by default as opposed to being an equal metaphysical or spiritual quest. And I should say it's a very particular form of religion, often Salafism or Wahhabism, a deculturated form of religion, which is very different to their parental faith. So religion provides this very emphatic rejoinder to the identity offered by Western society, which these individuals feel has already rejected them anyway, and it's easy to understand why some of them at least might feel that way. If we look at the example of France and use France as a case study, and the experience of French Muslims, the public discourse in France has an ominous fear of Muslims, of the immigrant, of the other, and it's what leads to, amongst other things, the desecration of gravestones of French Muslim World War II veterans, sartorial restrictions on Muslim women's dress, but also, crucially, the linkage of dress to security and to violence. And of course we saw that most recently with the banning of the burkini in many towns in France. But I guess most significantly is what's helped spur the far right, the Front National, to victory in the European Parliament. This slide is produced by The Guardian, I think, and what it does, it compares the percentage that Muslims make up of any given population and contrasts that with the percentage that Muslims are perceived to make up of a given population. So the perceptions compared with the reality. So in France, Muslims make up about 7 or 8% of the population of France. But if you ask the average French person, then they think Muslims make up 31% of the population of France. So the average French person thinks that 1 in 3 French people are actually Muslim, compared to the 7 or 8% that they actually are. So a staggering disparity there. And that's pretty much reflected in any country in which the survey was done. How do you explain that? Well, part of that explanation would be that it's a reflection of the popular and media discourse on Muslim, which is overwhelmingly negative, overwhelmingly associated with security and violence and terrorism. But then it also presents Muslims as being some sort of unwelcome presence as well. And of course, this isn't restricted to France, and I could have chosen any number of images to make my point here. These are two. The image on the left is from a recent Polish front cover of a magazine, and it shows a white woman dressed in a European Union flag and these brown swarthy hands tearing away her clothes, and the title is The Islamic Rape of Europe. And on the top right we have an image from the Daily Mail in this country, and it shows refugees entering Europe, Muslim refugees entering Europe, alongside rats and other vermin. What's interesting is that both of these images have very strong parallels with precursors that we saw, anti-Semitic cartoons in the 1930s, for example. So in that context, it's not difficult to see how, for many Muslims feeling under siege and alienated in their own country, an attractive religious identity might appear more appealing than a tainted national one. And of course, groups that prey on this kind of alienation end up benefiting enormously. ISIS issues new passports to anyone who travels there, particularly fighters, and many of them then publicly burn their original national identity documents in response. And so it's acting as a kind of welcoming utopia. And this idea of a welcoming utopia is really quite important to ISIS propaganda. When we think of ISIS propaganda, we think of the brutal violence, we think of the beheadings, the burnings, the crucifixions, we think of what you might call the pornography of violence, which deliberately targets Western audiences and Western sensibilities. But actually the overwhelming majority of IS media content, something like 80% or more, is in fact centered around other things, around depictions of blissful civilian life in this kind of utopian caliphate. It's about state building, about identity and welcoming, about joining a community, about escaping persecution, enjoying religious freedoms. Take, for example, these images from ISIS's flagship English language magazine, Derek, and they present this positive utopian image of the caliphate. And that really is the positive, that's part of the utopian narrative of belonging and sanctuary, of new beginnings and state building, which has really proven so important to ISIS's success. This is from issue 11 of Derbic, and it shows happy brothers in arms, multiracial brothers in arms, alongside the concept of loyalty to believers and disavowal of disbelievers. And it's juxtaposed against what it claims is its opposite, American racism. And actually it's no accident this issue came out when the hashtag Black Lives Matter was trending in the US, so very clear to create these stark contrasts. And ISIS has truly attempted not just to capitalize on these feelings of alienation, but actually hopes to actively build and nurture them too by creating conditions in Western societies that work towards these outcomes. After the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, for example, the February issue of Derbic wrote of polarizing the world by destroying its greatest threat, the grey zone. And the grey zone is that space in which it's possible to be both a young Frenchman and a good French citizen, and also a good Muslim, without any inherent contradiction. You can be both of those things. But for ISIS, that's a threat. They want to destroy that. And ISIS anticipated that provocative terrorist attacks like the ones that we saw in Paris would goad the French towards overreaction and create this climate of fear and hostility, further alienating French Muslims from wider society. Western Muslims would then be forced to make one of two choices between either apostasy or ISIS's sort of bastardized version of belief. The final issue worth focusing on here is the role played by socioeconomic factors and marginalisation. Many of the individuals from France and Belgium particularly have hailed from the French banlieues or from other ghetto-like areas around Brussels, for example. They're often characterised as environments providing a heady mix of unemployment, crime, drugs, institutional racism, and endemic cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. And it's in these sorts of scenarios that radical groups might potentially offer an escape from a bleak future or a criminal past. This slide is a few years old now, but it's a very shocking statistic. This compares the percentage that Muslims make up of any given population with the percentage that Muslims make up of the prison population in that country. So sticking with France as an example, Muslims make up about 7 or 8% of the population of France. And of course this is outdated now, but Muslims make up about 70% of the population of France's prisons. So they make up 7% of the population of France, but make up 70% of the population of French prisons. A factor of 10 difference. I mean, it's a startling disparity there. That sort of statistic should collectively shame us all, in a sense. And anyone who tries to explain to you why France is the biggest exporter of militants to the Middle East, to ISIS, without fundamentally touching on this elephant on the room, isn't really giving you the entire picture. So, religion provides a kind of redemptive identity, and it provides, perhaps for the first time, a sense of being part of an elite group that compensates for the shortcomings of their own trivial existence and insignificance. It allows these individuals to think of themselves as warriors, as heroes, as champions of the community, and of course very cleverly uses pop culture references to sell these identities too. On the right-hand side there we have Call of Duty, the most popular video game of our time. For those of you who don't know, you play as a soldier, and then when you die in the game, you come back, you respawn as a new character. So this says, this is our Call of Duty, and we respawn in paradise. Now, in direct contrast to these feelings of boredom and purposelessness and insignificance, the jihadists offer redemption through the image of the chivalrous warrior, and the individual recast as some sort of avenging hero for the victimized community. Following the Charlie Hebdo attack, Islamic State's official radio station praised the jihadi heroes who had avenged the Prophet, and in the process had validated the Qashi brothers' transformation from petty criminals and nobodies suddenly into heroes of the Ummah, heroes of Islam. And this appeal to the valiant holy warrior or the chivalrous knight is really a recurring theme in jihadist literature, and the Islamic State's propaganda machine has been busy pumping out material that shrewdly seeks to exploit these tensions. Recent social media agitprop, for example, includes the telling phrases, "Sometimes people with the worst pasts create the best futures," and "Why be a loser when you can be a martyr?" And I want to leave you with that question. If you're faced with a young man who's marginalised economically, politically, socially perhaps, and who's buying into this sort of propaganda, how do you respond to that question? Why be a loser when you can be a martyr? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Martha.
So as Simon said, the chapter in the book and my comments today are very much my own comments and do not reflect the views of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which hopefully means that certainly in the question and answer afterwards I can be a bit more open with my view than I would ordinarily be. So my chapter in the book looks at Afghanistan in particular. It started off as an idea where I was going to try and look across the entirety of South Asia. But then, as those of you who work on South Asia know, there are so many different groups operating across South Asia with so many different narratives, or certainly so many different sort of versions of narratives, that it became quite difficult. So in the end, the chapter looks at Afghanistan as a particular case study and the Afghan Taliban as a case study. So looking at how the Afghan Taliban responded to the Arab Spring, but also how they responded to the rise of the Islamic State, and what that said about their relationship with Al-Qaeda in particular. So the Taliban has long sought to balance its support to Al-Qaeda with a local and nationalist agenda. So the Arab Spring really didn't have much of an impact here, and the first part of the chapter goes into some detail around this, about the fact that the Afghan Taliban, the developments in the Arab Spring seemed so far away geographically, but also not quite as relevant to their support base that they already had within Afghanistan. It's the rise of Islamic State and the Syrian conflict which challenged some of elements of the Afghan Taliban's narrative, but also forced them to comment on things which were still geographically very far away, but were having much more of an impact at home. The result of all of this is a polarised debate. So the Taliban and its supporters, including Al-Qaeda, are on one side, and then you have the Islamic State, and particularly the Islamic State Khorasan province, which is the affiliate that Islamic State has in South Asia, on the other side. And what that has done is it has forced people to pick a side. You are either with the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda, or you are with Islamic State. And there is no really middle ground anymore between the two groups. It also forces the Taliban and other groups to fight against this rival Sunni organisation that has appeared in Afghanistan. And that's a really new development, which I think is very interesting. So before I started to look at some of the more recent developments, I thought it would be useful to just look at a little bit of a brief history of Afghanistan, which I think is very important when we come to look at what the groups are doing now. The anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s was a melting pot for extremism. So you had lots and lots of different people from different countries across the world going to Afghanistan to fight this jihad against the Soviet Union. And it was the Syria of its day, although even then the number of foreign fighters that went to Afghanistan is nothing in comparison to the people who go to Syria. Abdullah Azzam and Osama bin Laden set up a group which sought to unite the Mujahideen, and particularly sought to make it easier for people to travel and participate in the jihad. This is a group that later became known as Al-Qaeda. In November 1989, Abdullah Azzam was killed, and it's still unclear who did that. There are lots of conspiracy theories about whether or not it was actually somebody within Al-Qaeda who killed Abdullah Azzam, but I don't think we will ever quite work out who did it. But without Azzam, Osama bin Laden was free to develop Al-Qaeda alone and take it in the direction to which we know Al-Qaeda right now. Bin Laden relocated to Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and then back to Afghanistan in 1996. And during that time, the Afghan Taliban had gained power in Afghanistan, and they were influenced by Pashtun society, Jihadism, and to some extent Salafism as well. This resulted in a form of governance that was particularly at the extreme end of what was acceptable in the largely conservative Pashtun south of Afghanistan, and they were willing to support Al-Qaeda's move back to Afghanistan. But Al-Qaeda and the Taliban's relationship became a growing problem, and this is even before the 9/11 attacks. What we saw was that Osama bin Laden started to say more and more publicly about his hatred of the US and the West. We have his two fatwas that he released in 1996 and 1998, which made it very clear exactly where he stood and how he viewed the West, how he viewed Israel, and all sorts of other things. In 1998, you also had the East Africa embassy bombings, which again put a lot of pressure on the Taliban and their relationship and the fact that they were harbouring Al-Qaeda. To try and, I think, offset some of this, in 1998, bin Laden pledged his allegiance to Mullah Omar. So he said at that point, and this is really important in terms of how Al-Qaeda now sees the Afghan Taliban, bin Laden said, "You, Mullah Omar, you are the authority that sits above me, and my group, Al-Qaeda, will pledge allegiance to you." And that is something that we still see to this day. Al-Qaeda and all of its affiliates pledge allegiance to the Afghan Taliban as the ultimate authority above them. Despite the increasing pressure on the Taliban to do something about this group called Al-Qaeda that seemed to be sort of gathering a bit of momentum and was conducting these sorts of attacks, the Taliban didn't do anything about it. And I think part of that is because Al-Qaeda was bankrolling the Taliban at that point, but also there was probably some ideological sympathy and also something to do with the tribal norms of hospitality and Pashtun society that meant that they felt that they couldn't do anything about it. But the Taliban took a decision in its media to not mention Al-Qaeda, preferring instead to concentrate on the nationalist narratives that it had used up until that point. We saw this continue during the Arab Spring, so suddenly we had this chain of events that occurred that everybody was talking about, and it seemed odd to me that the Taliban weren't really commentating about it. So the only example that I saw was a very swift response to the fall of Mubarak, and the Taliban used that as an example and said, this has happened, you Afghans should follow this example and we can achieve the same thing in Afghanistan. But there wasn't much else in terms of media commentary. Perhaps the Taliban were wondering how they would translate these developments so many thousands of miles away to an audience who really perhaps didn't even understand really what was going on and felt like it didn't really have that much relevance. The other thing is that at this point, the Taliban didn't have a competitor at home. So it had nobody else who was sending out these sorts of messages, talking about the Arab Spring. It didn't have to compete with anybody else. The only group that was talking about it was Al-Qaeda, and this is covered in a different chapter of the book. But the Al-Qaeda statements weren't really challenging the Taliban in any way because the two are sort of linked in one way. So they didn't have a competitor and they didn't have anything to challenge. This changed when we saw the rise of the Islamic State, and we saw that the Taliban was pushed for the first time to actually start to comment on some of the events that were happening overseas, but also increasingly to comment on the activities of other Sunni Islamist groups. And this traditionally hasn't been something that the Taliban has done. When the Islamic State broke from Al-Qaeda, it also broke from the Taliban. So as I said, Al-Qaeda has this ultimate authority to the Taliban. So when the Islamic State moved away from Al-Qaeda, it also at the same time broke away from the Taliban. The creation of ISIL's caliphate in Syria and Iraq challenged the Taliban's status as the providers of the model Islamic emirate, but also at that time Mullah Omar's position as the leader of the faithful, something that he passed on to the two people who have taken on leadership of the Taliban after him. Islamic State also launched a media campaign to put pressure on the Taliban to account for Mullah Omar's whereabouts, his religious credibility and his relevance to the current jihad. This was before anybody was aware that Mullah Omar had actually died in 2013. The Syrian conflict more broadly was also a challenge for the Taliban because they had their 20-year struggle that was still ongoing in Afghanistan and hadn't really in recent years actually achieved very much, versus the huge gains that Islamic State had achieved in Iraq and Syria. And it was quite hard for them to be able to tell these people who were leaving Afghanistan or weren't even coming to Afghanistan in the first place because Syria was so much more attractive, that actually they would have success at some point in time, because these were people who were attracted to the immediate success of the Islamic State instead. By June 2014, the Taliban reacted and they issued a statement which didn't mention Islamic State in particular, but cautioned against extremism in religion and urged groups to work together rather than fighting one another. But still, there was no real comment there that actively criticised the Islamic State. In January 2015, the creation of the Islamic State Khorasan province, so ISIL's affiliate in Afghanistan and Pakistan, was announced. And this meant that there was now a rival Sunni group that the Taliban was having to fight right on their doorstep for the first time. Islamic State Khorasan province, or ISKP, focused on sectarian narratives, so they really sought to do the thing that the Taliban hasn't been doing. So whilst they mimicked the Taliban's nationalist agenda, they also really focused on minorities in Afghanistan as a way of gaining support. In the process, they've created many enemies, so the Taliban don't like them, Al-Qaeda doesn't like them, the remnants of the coalition forces in Afghanistan don't like them, and of course the Kabul government also doesn't like them. So they have so many enemies that they spend the majority of their time fighting against those enemies. They've also resorted to very dirty tactics, such as assassinations of Taliban shadow governors and all those sorts of things as well. So under significant pressure, but they're still attracting new members, particularly young members, who used to be former Taliban members but then moved across to Islamic State, so showing that there is still some room there within the narratives for this new one to come along. What was interesting though for me, and what I think the majority of the chapter in the book concentrates on, is when the Afghan Taliban decided that the time was right to actually launch a pretty much full-on campaign against the Islamic State. So this was led by Mullah Mansour, who took over from Mullah Omar but was then killed himself. And he addressed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi directly and said, if people who claim to be affiliated with you create serious trouble for the Islamic Emirate, it will lead to anger amongst Muslims against you. And he also went on to criticise several of ISKP's operations in Afghanistan. And really, I suppose from a Taliban perspective, it was unfortunate that Mullah Mansour was then killed during a US drone strike, because he was really leading the charge against ISIL. He had a very different approach to Mullah Omar before him and decided that the time was right to tackle them directly, tackle them head on. He also talked about his links to Al-Qaeda in a way that Mullah Omar had never done previously. So when it was announced that Mullah Omar had died, so it was announced in July 2015, but actually he died in April 2013, all of Al-Qaeda's groups responded to this announcement really quickly, including the Al-Qaeda leader himself. And for the first time, Mullah Mansour responded. So having been announced as a new leader, he responded and thanked Zawahiri directly for his statement. And that is very interesting, because for such a long period of time, the Taliban hadn't commented on its relationship with Al-Qaeda, hadn't really commented that much on events outside of Afghanistan, but all of a sudden we're putting out a public message that said, thank you very much, Al-Qaeda, for your statement of allegiance. We very much appreciate it. And that is a real change there. But, and this is where the chapter ends, the death of Mullah Mansour meant that a lot of that kind of drive to be closer aligned in terms of public messaging with Al-Qaeda ended with Mansour's death. And what we have at the moment is Mansour's replacement as head of the Taliban hasn't really taken the same approach. So whilst in private, the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda are still very much working closely together, we don't have the same pace of media outputs. But what the rise of Islamic State in Afghanistan has done is it has pushed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda together. So they have a mutual enemy that they are fighting against, and this has meant that they have come closer together. And I think whilst they have that mutual enemy, and whilst they are working together against the rise of Islamic State, and certainly the spread of Islamic State across wider parts of Afghanistan, it will continue to disrupt the peace process. So the chances of a wedge being driven between the two groups, for me, seems much more unlikely now that we have the Islamic State. Going forward, I think the narrative which will resonate for a lot longer in Afghanistan is very much the nationalist narrative. So either Islamic State will have to change their narrative or will simply disappear, and the Taliban narrative will be the one narrative that is sustained. But for the time being, there certainly seems like a younger generation of Talibs who are much more susceptible to ISIL's narrative, its use of social media, and some of the propaganda outputs that were on screen earlier, and is attracting them to this brand. But I don't see that as being something that will last into the longer term, just because that nationalist narrative is a lot stronger in Afghanistan.
Excellent, thank you very much. Last but not least, Virginia.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll ask you to leave Afghanistan and come with me to Nigeria. My chapter focused on the relationship between Boko Haram and Islamic State, and actually the establishment of a West African province last year. So I will focus my remarks primarily on what is actually in the chapter, and then I will say a few words about some key developments that have occurred since the completion of the manuscript. For those who are less familiar with Boko Haram is a group that emerged in the northern part of Nigeria in the early 2000s. And over time, he has graduated from being an isolated, primarily non-violent sect into a fully fledged Islamist insurgency against the Nigerian state, and has been fighting since 2009-2010, and expanding his campaign of violence in neighboring countries into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Boko Haram's ultimate goal is a fairly domestic one, is the one to establish an Islamic State in Nigeria, and possibly into the neighboring region. In March 2015, Boko Haram's leader Abu Bakr pledged his allegiance to al-Baghdadi. About a month later, the group actually rebranded itself as Islamic State West African province. This was indeed a major development for both groups. Of course, this was ISIS' first foothold in sub-Saharan Africa. And I would say among all the groups that have pledged allegiance to ISIS, Boko Haram was the deadliest of all. This was also, of course, a good thing for Boko Haram. In the months up to the Pledge of Allegiance, Boko Haram had suffered some severe losses, lost some of the towns that it had captured. And so, of course, it was a great opportunity for Boko Haram to tell the world that it was still relevant. It was now part of the largest terrorist or jihadist group on the planet. But how did they get there? Well, Boko Haram over the years had established links with Al-Qaeda. Having said that, he never formally joined the Al-Qaeda franchise, and I think this is an important point, and some analysts would argue that that is one of the reasons why it was easier perhaps for Boko Haram compared to other groups to move from being in Al-Qaeda's sphere of influence into ISIS's one. So during the early days of Boko Haram, there were some contacts being made with Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. There were apparently some meetings with Al-Qaeda operatives in Saudi Arabia, usually to discuss possible funding and training so that attacks against Western and primarily American targets in Nigeria could be carried out. But it was really with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, that this Boko Haram-Al-Qaeda relationship became more apparent. We've seen over the years the transfer of weapons, training and knowledge, and also funding going from AQIM to Boko Haram. The way I see this relationship is an opportunistic rather than ideological one. Of course, there are ideological affinities between the two groups, but this was a relationship in which Boko Haram was always the junior partner, the one that was benefiting the most from this sort of partnership. And it is from AQIM that Boko Haram learned how to carry out suicide attacks, which had never occurred in the pre-Boko Haram era in Nigeria. They started kidnaps for ransoms, which is one of the trademarks of AQIM, something that was later adopted by Boko Haram as well, and in particular by its most infamous offshoot, Ansaro. A year before the actual pledge to Islamic State was given, we could observe that's possibly the basis for a more formalized relationship were being laid out. In April 2014, Abu Bakr Shekau, the leader of Boko Haram, praised ISIS for its actions in the Middle East. At the same time, al-Baghdadi praised Boko Haram for the mass abduction of the Chibok girls, and actually used this example as a way of justifying their own treatment of the Yazidi girls and women. And so we say this process had started way before the actual pledge had taken place. So when the pledge happened, and then it was followed by the rebranding of the group, I thought it was very interesting to see that while it was the leader who had announced the pledge, the rebranding was announced by someone else. And I always wondered to what extent Boko Haram's leader actually endorsed this rebranding. I was also curious and wondering how this new partnership would actually impact the fighting on the ground in Nigeria. Because for several months, all we could see was Boko Haram becoming more proficient on the social media sphere, but not much change on the ground, really. So we saw Boko Haram producing videos that were much more sophisticated. They used similar backdrops and background music to the ones produced by Islamic State. Boko Haram even opened a Twitter account, which I think it was surprising that they didn't have one before, to be honest. Over time, however, more reports became available indicating some physical contacts between Boko Haram and ISIS in Libya. And I think from a logistical point of view, it does make much more sense for the Nigerians to interact with ISIS in North Africa as opposed to in Iraq or in Syria. as we know, both Boko Haram and ISIS are big fans of indiscriminate and very brutal killings, but they also have lots of, well, some significant differences. And the two that have really made me question the nature of the relationship have to do with state building and local versus global agendas. Boko Haram, shortly after al-Baghdadi declared a state, Boko Haram did the same. Babu Rak Shekau declared a state in Borno State, which is the far northeastern part of Nigeria, declared there was a capital, the town of Gwoza, and appointed a number of senior leaders as emirs of some of those towns. However, in terms of governance and services and infrastructures, nothing was done. Even from an economic point of view, there was clearly no strategy, no planning going on the part of Boko Haram. Of course, northern Nigeria doesn't have the oil fields of Iraq. It doesn't have the antiquities that could be smuggled in exchange for to build their revenues. But still, I felt there was no planning, and there was only violence that was used to control the population. So no long-term view on the part of Boko Haram, which made it even more unrealistic for them to expect to be able to sustain their state or territorial control efforts. The other issue has to do with agendas. Even though Boko Haram has managed to expand into neighboring countries, its agenda is a domestic one. We can speculate that the spread into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon is not so much an attempt to take over all the countries of West Africa, but rather to recreate the ancient Kanem-Borno Empire that was in existence between the 9th and 19th century in that part of the world, and which also included parts of Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon. And of course, today's borders, they don't really matter much for Boko Haram, and the leader is really trying to exploit those ethnic and community links among communities that live across national borders. And this domestic agenda, I think, has also had an impact on Boko Haram's ability to recruit from beyond the region. In fact, unlike ISIS, we haven't seen a flux of foreign fighters going to Nigeria, which traditionally has not been an attractive theater of jihad for people from outside the region. As it is often the case, if we look at the many groups from around the world who have pledged allegiance to ISIS, either at the group level or some individuals doing so, some tensions have and fractures actually have emerged as a result of the pledge. Boko Haram already contains a number of different factions, and with slightly different goals. Most interestingly, however, was the summer when a new leader was actually identified. Abu Musab al-Barnawi was named the new leader of Islamic State's West African province, ISWAP, the rebranded Boko Haram, effectively pushing Shekau to the side. Unsurprisingly, because if you know the character, that's what he does, a few hours following the statement, Shekau issued its own one saying, "I'm going to second, I am the only leader." This time, however, we are seeing some changes on the ground that reflects the different outlooks of these two groups, the Boko Haram, the traditional Boko Haram under Shekau, and the new Boko Haram rebranded ISWAP under al-Barnawi. Shekau has in fact continued with his indiscriminate killing. Anyone is fair game, civilians, military, government, foreigners and locals alike. In the case of al-Barnawi and its followers, they have taken a more strategic approach and strategic targeting. So they prefer to target government, military and foreign interests and individuals and buildings, and to leave civilians alone. Having said that, one common trend, I would say, that has emerged, if we look at the evolution of Boko Haram over time, it is a very opportunistic entity. And I would not be surprised if at some point in the not so distant future, even the group now rebranded Islamic State West African Province would actually abandon the ISIS sphere of influence and actually go back to Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. Also importantly, since the pledge, there was no statement issued by the group that was in any way derogatory towards Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb in particular. So, and this is just my gut feeling because it's early days in this respect, but I wouldn't be surprised if some channels of communications are kept open. And when I talk about opportunism, I also think of the fact that probably the al-Barnawi group has basically had to make a choice to either wait again for more time for an Al-Qaeda caliphate to be established, and I guess they were kind of losing their hope with that, or actually take the, in a way, easiest option and side with ISIS, which has actually made some progress towards achieving that. Looking at Shekau, I think they probably hopes that the ties with ISIS have not completely been severed, and probably that al-Baghdadi had not abandoned him, but rather al-Barnawi had manipulated the communication between Boko Haram and ISIS in a way that actually he would get the top job and Shekau would be pushed to the side. So as a final note, I think that while this is very important from the point of view of Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin region, I think that ISIS is preoccupied with what's happening in Libya and in the Middle East, and those things will be higher priorities for al-Baghdadi than any developments in the Lake Chad Basin for the moment. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that's given us a rich diet of detail and analysis. We can run through till 3 o'clock if we need to. If you stick your hand up and I recognise you, could you say two things? One, who you are, but more importantly, which of the four panellists or all of them you address your question to. I see Ben Barry at the back, who can have the first question.
Could I congratulate the panellists for the exemplary clarity of their presentations, for which I've learned a lot. I'm the land warfare expert here at IISS and a former counterinsurgent. A battle for ideas has two sides. Have you got anything to say about the effectiveness of counter-narratives and indeed, in the case of ISIS, efforts to shut down their propaganda operation?
Right, who wants to stab at that first? Probably a bad analogy. Simon?
Oh, thank you so much, Simon. I was speaking to the Global Engagement Center a couple of weeks back, which is the new US counter-narrative kind of hub. And a lot of us have been quite critical of this idea of counter-narratives because I think the title of my paper was the double fetish of narrative, of CBE. And to fetishize means to imbue something with this kind of magical quality that belies its banal reality. Now, I've presented to you, for example, you look at the example of France, I presented to you clear examples of structural inequality, marginalization, things that affect people in real life, in their real lives, everyday lives. And the narratives only resonate when they, only have an impact when they resonate with the very real lived experiences of people in those situations. And so to expect a counter-narrative, so simply to work on the messaging as some kind of panacea is quite laughable in a sense, and ignores a decade of research on radicalization and probably a century of research on propaganda, on the way messages are understood by audiences, why they resonate, and all those sorts of things. So, if ISIS ended tomorrow, for example, France would still have a major problem in its hands. That would not go away. And one thing that I point to as an example of this, about 10 years ago we had riots in many parts of France around some of the same areas we're talking about, the banlieues. We had burnings of cars and France even invoked a state of emergency at the time. And there was no Islamism or jihadism that we were speaking about then, but we were speaking about the same people, really. We were speaking about the second, third, fourth generation progeny of North African migrants, broadly speaking. And then if you go back another 10 years before that, and I recently rewatched an excellent film, La Haine, some of you may have seen that, and that deals with a very similar group of marginalized young men in these areas. And what's surprising about that film is how little it's dated, really, in a sense, how relevant it still is. So if you're not addressing any of the structural issues that we're saying are really fundamental in allowing narratives to resonate, then you're not really addressing them at all. And I can understand why governments do this, because of course they want to be seen to be doing something by publics, and of course it's cheap to invest in narratives, particularly if you talk about digital narratives, and that's where the double fetish comes in. To address the prison issue, for example, would take institutional change that, over the course of a number of generations to even begin to address. That takes time and money and resources, and most importantly, political will. And I'll stop there because
Martha.
So, from my perspective, I think counter-narratives are one part of a much bigger strategy of trying to degrade, defeat, undermine, whatever word you want to apply to it. To do that, to ISIL, you need to do many different things. Counter-narratives is part of it, but you also need things like the military activity against the Islamic State, because if their media is promoting an image of them having created a wonderful caliphate and a wonderful place to live, then you need to do something about that at the same time, which can help undermine their message. Although some would also say that can also help improve their message, because then they have something to talk about, and the fact that they had created something wonderful and now we, the West, have taken it away, so it works both ways. You can also take a kind of broader definition of it, because I think sometimes counter-narratives, it tends to focus on what governments are doing to try and tackle the ISIL message. But actually there are lots of other things. So for instance, the way that Islamic State works with its distribution of propaganda is that the central part of Islamic State that deals with its media output is actually relatively small. They don't actually produce all that much propaganda, although it does take various different forms. The bit that is, for me, most concerning is the fact that they then have lots and lots of supporters who tend to be young men and women who are sat in their bedrooms and who are on Twitter and who are disseminating the propaganda, that you essentially have quite a small bit in the middle, but then all of these supporters who are kind of making the message look like it's much bigger and that this whole organisation is much bigger than it really is. And that's where you can do things like working with tech companies to try and get people to sort of look at how the message is disseminated in more of a technical way and trying to take that down. But that brings you into difficulties with things like freedom of speech. The other thing that I think is important when it comes to counter-narratives is not to focus on the speaker. So to focus on who it is that you're trying to get the message out to try and counter Islamic State. And for me, we can end up being in quite a difficult position, because actually the people who have the most credibility is certainly not me, but there are lots of ideologues who are based in Jordan, actually, in most cases, who have spoken out since the very start against Islamic State and are very credible when they talk about the fact that actually this is an organisation that has created a caliphate that has, in their mind, no religious basis whatsoever, and that the organisation as a whole is not following the correct version of Islam in their eyes. And these are jihadi Salafi ideologues who have a lot of credibility within particular circles. And these are people who could be used more for counter-narratives, but the flip side of that is that whilst they say they don't like Islamic State, they do say that they like Al-Qaeda. And that puts us in a very difficult position, and that is something that Islamic State has done quite well, intentionally or otherwise, through its messaging, is to put us in quite a difficult position when it comes to counter-narratives, in that, for me, the most effective way of tackling this problem is to tap into those sorts of people who can credibly undermine the narrative, but that takes us into a very difficult position that we don't want to really be getting into. So my ultimate answer on it would be, I think, that it can be effective, it can be an effective tool as part of a wider strategy, so one part of a strategy, but also we need to think very hard about the speaker and who it is that we're trying to use to undermine ISIL, because otherwise that can undo the effectiveness if it's not quite the right person.
Right, let's take a group of questions. You caught my eye first, and then you, sir, and then you, ma'am. Yeah, okay.
Yes, member, we would have to. I have a comment. Thank you. Irrespective of different names, free democratic societies must confront all organizations to represent Sunni global Islamic terrorism. We Wahhabi extremist philosophy of Saudi Arabia, funding by Saudi and other Sunni Gulf states for extremist mosques and madrasas, various organizations, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, or whatever, and countries like Pakistan, which has and continues to support against Taliban, LEJ, and other terrorist organizations which attack Afghanistan and India. Now, we shouldn't forget that Bin Laden was killed by US forces in the Pakistani army camp of Abbottabad. He was there for 4 years, and all these mullahs have been killed. And still, the leaders of Afghan Taliban are freely moving around in Pakistan. So it's a terrorist state. So without exception, all of this should be confronted if free democratic societies want to get rid of this problem once for all. Otherwise, like various rates of hike, it will keep coming up in various countries and we will pay the price. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, yes. Gentleman here with the... There you go.
Yeah, hello, thank you. I have a question for Martha Turnbull, just regarding Al-Qaeda itself. As you know, we've heard of Jama'at Khorasan in Yemen, which is linked with Al-Qaeda. Can you just tell us if it's another hybrid that's going to be another Qaeda hybrid that's going to be Daesh or going to be something else? What is it exactly? And one more thing, just for the comment for the sir here. I'm Abdullah from the Kuwait Embassy. So thank you, Mr. Tawbi, as usual. And for the Sunni states and so for Kuwait, we are victims of Daesh and Al-Qaeda and everything. But we are still doing our best and we're trying to stop these fundings and so on. By how? By getting control of the banking. As we have now a lot of regulations, it's very hard now to send money and everything. And even with foundations, now we are strict rules and from the government side and from the interior side and of course from the Foreign Ministry of Affairs. So,
Thank you. And the final question in this round, yes, the lady here with the striped shirt.
Hi. I think one of the reasons that what made ISIS so distinct from other terrorist groups and successful was that its narrative about caliphate and its military capability to support that. And as ISIS is losing its territories that they are claiming, that how do you expect ISIS to survive, or do you expect ISIL to change their narrative? Thank you.
Excellent. So we've got 3 questions, one directly addressed to Martha, so she can go first, but the second and third around, does the ISIS die when it loses its territory, or does its narrative change? And then the confronting of the sources and the funding of state sponsors of terrorism, I suppose, is that issue. And then the reverse of that, the states in the Gulf that have done a lot to strangle or to stop funding and jihadists going. But first, Martha, you can answer that and anything else you want.
Thank you. Can I just double check, your question was about a group in Yemen?
yes,
Khorasan in Yemen. So I will have to admit that I do not cover Yemen, so I don't have an answer for you. However, I can take it away and ask my Yemen analyst. What I would say is that I remain very concerned about Al-Qaeda groups in Yemen and what they are doing there. One of the things that they have done very well in the past is changing their identity to try and mask the fact that they're an Al-Qaeda group. And we saw that through the spread of groups named Ansar Sharia instead of Al-Qaeda, and effectively they were AQAP. So it wouldn't surprise me if there is another group there, and I suppose the name of that group would suggest that they would have links back to the Khorasan region, so perhaps it is entirely plausible that it is linked back to them in some way or another, but I'm afraid I simply don't know. On the ISIL and its narrative and the role of the caliphate and the military capability, I think what we've seen already is that they're changing their narrative. So they used to rely on a narrative of remaining and expanding, which was something that they featured a lot in their English language magazine, Dabiq, and they talked about the fact that they had this caliphate, they wanted to keep it and they wanted to expand it further. That's now changed, and a lot of the narrative is focusing on the fact that ISIL needs to survive as an organisation and that it will survive, but also recently we've seen them talking a lot more about the fact that they don't really need territory. So some of their recent publications have said, you can take back Mosul, you can take back Raqqa, and you can take back Sirte in Libya as well. And that doesn't matter to us because we are fundamentally an organisation that appeared out of the desert, and we don't need these grand cities. We will just go back to the desert again, we will regroup and we will reappear as this organisation that will challenge you. So that shows that they have already changed their narrative and are perhaps anticipating even further territorial losses as the military campaign against them increases.
Simon.
Just to build on that last point about the narrative about remaining and expanding and when it's the caliphate, I think I agree with that, but as far as it goes, but then I think there is also something about, and going back to the text that we looked at 2 years ago, I thought it was quite interesting, that another of the themes was that, and this is kind of a qualitative difference in the text, you often with jihadist narratives, when groups are getting more into feeling like they need to do that kind of political commentary and shifting their ideological response, it tends to be when they're on much more uncertain ground, and it tends to be when they're struggling a lot more. So I think it's interesting now that clearly there is the material challenge, which is an existential challenge to the idea that there is a physical state and we're going to continue to remain and expand. But more optimistically, I think longer term, there is that is putting, in terms of the ideas and the narrative, Islamic State into a very uncomfortable position where they need to rationalise and they need to calibrate all of those ideas. So there's a more kind of optimistic, longer term existential challenge. However, shorter term, because of all of that recalibration, I think it simply makes things a lot more unpredictable. And because before he was killed, Al-Adnani, of course, was already talking about stay at home, don't bother to come, focus on kind of lone actors at home, both Daesh, also AQAP in the most recent edition of Inspire, saying similar kinds of things. So there's kind of short-term heightened risks, heightened unpredictability, but potentially longer-term some more room for optimism in terms of the damage to the organisation and what that means.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure, of course. Well, one thing I was thinking of is that given all this territorial loss, the proliferation of new groups pledging allegiance might be even a more welcome development. If we look at the sub-Saharan Africa case already, we have 2 groups that have pledged allegiance. We even have Islamic State in the Greater Sahara group that was announced in the summer. It has not been formally recognized by ISIS, but has already committed 2 attacks, so one in September this year and one just last month in Burkina Faso, close to the border with Niger and Mali. And earlier in the spring, a group based in Kenya, Tanzania, Jabba East Africa, has also pledged allegiance to Islamic State. This is far from becoming the East Africa province, but that seems to be their thinking. And late last month, they took over a small port town and displayed the ISIS flag. So it's still unclear to me to what extent these groups are actually linked to ISIS, or whether they are simply taking on the name and pledging the allegiance without receiving any formal recognition. But I think an argument could be made for actually supporting this proliferation of groups because it reinforces the image of ISIS. But I totally agree that also this equates to greater unpredictability in terms of violence and attacks.
Okay, yes, you sir. and then you, ma'am, and then you, sir, next. Sorry.
Yes, David Ismay, IIS member for Martha Turnbull. In Afghanistan, do you see IS, while is limited in its impact, do you see this as one, possibly affecting non-Pashtun groups for membership, and two, having any impact on Sunni Shia conflicts inside Afghanistan?
Excellent. Yes, the lady there. Thanks. Excellent, sir.
William Wallace. I think it's probably for President Awan, but I understood him to be saying, in fact, that radical Islam is there as an ideology which fits the alienation and situation that a lot of people find themselves in. And I wondered whether any of you had done some comparison with previous millennial ideologies and movements. A young Muslim happened last week to say, well, of course, the Anabaptists in the mid-17th century were seen as an existential threat to the Christian world because of the violence and everything else that they had. I thought about the obvious comparisons with Marxistanism as an identified ideology in the third world in the 60s and 70s. Do you see this as a useful comparison, or does the religious element of it maybe very different from previous examples?
We could, of course, link the third and fourth question, Trump and radicalism on the internet, but possibly that's not the thing to do. Martha, the first question to you, and then we'll broaden it out.
Okay, so on Islamic State, Khorasan province, I think it's interesting when you look at what they're trying to do. So they certainly have tried to tap into the Uzbek support base and to some extent the Tajik support base as well. Part of that is through the pledges of allegiance that they received, but then seemed to be retracted, but then received again from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which is very much from a very different non-Pashtun support base. ISKP is active across many different areas of Afghanistan, which has always surprised me. So it is active in parts of the east, in the south, in the north, and also there are some indications that it may also be active in the west. So small pockets of activity in each of those places, but still interesting that they haven't just focused on one particular area. And you mentioned also the Sunni Shia element to all of this. So for me, again, what was interesting was that when ISKP emerged, it was very clear that they were going to, in the way that all Islamic State affiliated groups do, they were going to draw on the sectarian narrative. And one of the questions was, actually, is there a support base for this in Afghanistan? Because the Afghan Taliban haven't drawn on this since the 1990s and have pushed against any kind of sectarian attacks. But ISKP went ahead with it and found that actually there was a support base for this sectarian narratives, for picking on the minorities within Afghanistan. And despite the fact that they have been criticised by the Afghan Taliban for doing that, they have continued that as a key part of their narrative and their operational successes. So I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Thank you. Okay, let me tackle the elephant in the room, the literal elephant in the room, Trump. But one of the interesting things, of course, is we don't actually know what impacts he will probably have on the narrative. In a sense, we've seen some tentative kind of comments from people outside of ISIS, but who might inhabit that space. Some welcoming the fact that the end of America is imminent now because Trump is in power, for example. But this reminds me a little bit of previous comments that we had from bin Laden himself, and the idea of sort of reciprocal legitimation. And we had the global war on terror, the idea of the clash of civilizations, and of course the reciprocal legitimation means that both sides are, in a sense, doing the same job, in a way, but from the opposite end. And Bin Laden made a very curious comment. He said at one point, he said, sometimes it sounds like, talking about George Bush, sometimes it sounds like the White House and we are on the same team. We're aiming for the same objectives, which is a very striking thing to point out. And then when McCain was running against Obama in 2008, one of his senior advisors went on television and said that a terrorist attack would be a good thing for the Republican Party, for their chance of victory. And of course he lost his job as a result. Not for thinking that, but for saying it publicly on television. But the point is, the Republicans have always been seen as a stronger party if you think about security and defense and that sort of thing. And so there is this idea that they legitimize each other in a sense. But then of course Trump has shown himself to be less willing to engage in these kind of foreign policy endeavors, so we're not quite sure how that's going to play out. Do you want to touch on the question about youth as well?
Yeah, William's question about radicalization and the comparison with the Anabaptists and Marxist-Leninism.
Yeah, so my subset, and I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of these biographies, really relates to those who have gone over from Western Europe and been sort of radicalized here, broadly speaking, and how their religious literacy and their understanding of religion relates to what they think they're doing. But I think this also can apply to populations in other parts of the world as well. Of course, you can't compare someone who's grown up in Saudi Arabia with someone who has a very limited understanding of religion in, say, Bradford, for example. But nevertheless, two examples I'll give you. One was a young teacher in Aleppo, and he, of course, despised ISIS, but said that he at least was being paid now. And he was being paid twice the salary that he received previously, and 3 months prior to ISIS coming into power, he'd actually not been paid at all. So sometimes it's not about buying into the narrative, it's about tolerating the narrative. And I'll give you one other example, and this was a resident in Mosul, who said that she despised Sharia. She despised the hudud punishments, the traditional cutting of the hands and that sort of thing. But she said, at least I know what they are, and at least I know what to do not to fall afoul of them. Under Assad, people could be taken for completely arbitrary reasons and be held indefinitely without any reason. So just a few examples there about how something can be tolerated as opposed to being bought into. Now, in terms of what you're asking, I think it's a very useful question. I recently wrote the annual youth report for the United Nations and looked at this idea of youth radicalism from a much broader perspective. And there is something that says that the idea of radicalism is generally a youth phenomenon. It tends to increase when there's an increase in the youth demographic, when we have a youth bulge, so to speak, because most of these issues that we're talking about really are youth issues. If you're talking about socioeconomic marginalisation, about political disenfranchisement, and we know young people have these very naive ideas about changing the world, and of course when they don't manage to achieve this change, often they can have a soured idealism that can result in illegitimate sort of politics, if you like, and we see that in many, many places. But there have been waves, if you like, waves of terrorism, waves of political violence for a long time. Rappaport talks about the 4 waves of terrorism. The first wave, 1880s and 1920, we talk about the anarchists. From 1920 to 1960, we talk about the anti-colonial wave. And then from the 60s to about the mid-80s, we talk about the left wing, the extreme left-wing wave, and then we talk about the religious wave. These are just the zeitgeist of the time, the political ideology of the time, which latches on to whatever political disenfranchisement, socioeconomic marginalisation, identity crisis, all those sorts of things that I've spoken about, which allows those things to have an expression, I think, at that particular point. And I think that's part of the answer as well. Continue.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on the Trump question as far as it pertains Africa and CT in Africa. I believe Abu Bakr Shekau Bokram was the first leader of a terror group to actually make reference to Trump in a statement the other day. I don't know if any of your groups, guys, have actually issued any statement along those lines, but I think I've won on this front.
I'm not sure that's a win.
Anyway, so basically issued... I try. The other day he issued a statement acknowledging Trump's victory and basically saying, game on, expect a war from us. Over the past 10 days or so, I tried to figure out really what Trump's election means for the African continent, and I feel sometimes more guesswork than analytical work, because he hasn't really mentioned Africa that much during the campaign, and when he did, it was in an inappropriate context. When it comes to counterterrorism, my guess is that given the way he has spoken generally about counterterrorism in a very aggressive way, talking about the targeting of terrorists and their families, which by the way is against the Geneva Convention, and also encouraging torture, saying he would want to keep Guantanamo open and all of that, I think one could expect, even in the context of Africa and US counterterrorism in Africa, a more aggressive approach, which I think that together with his anti-Muslim rhetoric, which he has used in several occasions, I think is likely to feed terrorists' own narratives, and actually possibly fueling extremism and also helping recruiting for those groups. And I think this is also particularly worrisome because we have already seen how across the continent a city has been used as an excuse sometimes by some repressive leaders to actually repress political dissent, and we've seen it, from Ethiopia to Kenya, Cameroon, Nigeria, so on and so on and so forth. So I think we might actually see an increase of that as the US perhaps makes stronger city partnerships with some local countries.
Simon.
I have to emphasise my caveat, particularly given I'm going to work for our government in the US next week. On the Trump question, I would agree with a lot of that, and clearly there is grist for the mill of the war on Islam from some of those previous statements. I would also say, though, it kind of relates back to my previous point about when groups are talking more about political, getting more into political commentary. I see a correlation if we look over the last few years that when groups get in more that mode of we need to talk about the enemy and get much more involved in talking about the end of America and these kind of phrases, it tends to be when they feel more on the ropes and they've got less to say about their own positive proposition as they would see it around the caliphate. So I think that correlation is quite interesting as well. I think they're more in that mode at the moment, which is actually quite similar mode that we saw around 2011, Arab Spring, increasing Islamist participation in politics. That was also a time when jihadist groups talked a lot more about the end of America, US president, etc., and were much more obsessively focused on that rather than what are we doing and what's our overall vision. So that's a careful blow, but I do also accept the point about it is of propaganda value clearly. On sectarianism, there's an excellent chapter in the book by Christopher Anzalone who looks at detail at sectarianism, which I think is a hugely important area, as your question suggests. And what Christopher does is really picks apart how it has been instrumentalized by actors in Syria. Actually, on both sides, you have the Shia militia groups as well as use of sectarianism against the Shia. And the simple answer to your question is yes, it's hugely relevant if you look at any piece of Islamic State propaganda. Obsessive focus with the derogatory language for Shia groups on every page almost. So it's a huge focus. What Christopher does is kind of unpicks that and looks at how that is really an instrumentalization. Clearly, it doesn't correspond very neatly to actually how those groups are operating on the ground, but it's used in a certain way, clearly to try to for propaganda value. The thing that I think is also worrying about that, clearly it's worrying in itself and how it's manifested in Syria, but there is also a global trend of increasing sectarian attitudes and increasing influence on increasing focus on inside and outside, not necessarily only Shia Sunni, but also intra-Sunni sectarianism, which I think is of note, including in the West as well as in the Middle East. So I think as a trend, Christopher's work is extremely important in highlighting some of that.
Excellent. One last round of quick questions, if there are any. Yes, Robert Fox.
Sorry, I don't want to do a sort of round Africa tour, but could you comment on the situation in Tunisia in relation to ISIS activity in Libya? Because it did seem as if they were almost on the point of declaring somewhere around Kairouan an alternate Islamic State of the Maghreb, but we're not hearing so much about it now. Can you give a brief update?
Anyone else? Yes, you sir at the back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Porteous. Just a hopefully brief question at this juncture for Professor Awan relating to the nexus in the Venn diagram of the polarization and the radicalization process. I think the top one, the narrative, I think there is the means, and it's a mechanistic process of providing a counter-narrative. The bottom left of individual agency, I think you can probably provide physical barriers to movement and provide an effect to mitigate that. The right-hand edge, the sense of belonging and the cultural identity, which is driving quite a lot of the extremism, would you be prepared to suggest some of the sort of government-level interventions that might provide a mitigation for that?
Excellent, thank you. Well, we have, according to my watch, 3 minutes left. So if you each take a minute to answer as you come down the table, or just say anything you want and you feel that you need to, you don't want to take anything? No? Well, there's questions directly answered.
1 minute, okay. I'll answer your question in 1 minute if I can. Very good question. I think you're absolutely right. But if you're going to look at that area, that part of the Venn diagram, you clearly need to address some of the things that I've been speaking about. So in the UN report, which I can make available if you want, I make 3 recommendations. One is to address political disenfranchisement, to empower young people to make, to mobilize people to think about political socialization. You can't necessarily change people's minds and ideas about what they think is wrong with the world, but you can give them solutions about how they might address it. That's one thing. You can look at promoting inclusive forms of citizenship and identity. That's really important, to make people feel that they're part of their societies. Civic identity is very important. And the final thing is to address socioeconomic marginalization, to tackle blocked upward social mobility, for example. Tackling things that governments are good at normally doing, you know, tackling unemployment, tackling housing issues, education, all those sorts of things.
Thank you. And then with Robert Fox's Round Africa tour, Tunisia, anyone wants to comment on that? Martha?
Yeah, I mean, I think Islamic State's activities in Tunisia, and also you mentioned Libya as well, have really kind of waxed and waned. And I think for me, the thing going forward that I would be most concerned about right now would be the fact that because of some of their fortunes in Libya, it seems to me as though Islamic State is being pushed south. And that is concerning because the south of Libya is somewhere that I think, if we're being totally honest, we don't know quite as much about. We don't know what they're going to be doing there. There are rumours of things like training camps being established in the south of Libya. Those are the sorts of things that would potentially allow them to rebuild capabilities after losing, in some cases, significant portions of territory. What I would also say about Libya and Islamic State is that, by and large, what we saw was rebadging of existing groups to become part of Islamic State. And the question there is always, to what extent is this just something that seems like the right thing to do at the time, or is there really an ideological attachment to what it is that Islamic State is offering? And I've never really been convinced exactly how much support they really have from an ideological perspective in Libya. And Tunisia, which was the main part of your question, I think there have been some significant developments in Tunisia in terms of their counter-terrorism capabilities there. The concern would be around some of the youth population in Tunisia, problems with unemployment, all those sorts of things which can contribute towards or be potential drivers for radicalisation that could increase Islamic State or anybody else's support base in the future. So I'd be concerned about what could happen there, but I wouldn't see them stating that they had created an Islamic State in quite the same way as Syria and Iraq anytime soon. It's definitely not happening.
Final word to you, sir, on your way to Washington.
Thank you. We'll just use that final question as a plug. Jonathan Giddens-Mays, who wrote the chapter on Tunisia and talks about some of those issues of the youth population and radicalisation, will be at our event tomorrow at RUSI, and so he'll pick up that a bit more. And the only thing I would add, just for now very briefly, is an opportunity to mention something that we haven't talked about so much, the dispersal of foreign fighters after the loss of the physical state and Mosul, etc. So clearly that's going to be a huge challenge, particularly for Tunisia, where there's been lots of fighters, but also more broadly. So what happens when all of those people move? It is obviously going to be a really important theme. Tunisia is also different, of course, in terms of narratives and political engagement because of the local Islamist government and the difference in political process that's happened in Tunisia. So definitely important to watch and come and listen to Jonathan talk about it tomorrow.
Excellent. It's now 3 o'clock, so I've got the happy task of bringing this meeting to an end by thanking our 4 speakers, but also once again recommending what I think you now know is a superb book full of very prescient analysis and data. Thank you very much.